You wake up before light exists. Not dawn. There is no word for dawn yet. There is only the absence of fire and the presence of cold. The shelter around you is skin and bone, literally. The walls are animal hides stretched over mammoth ribs, and the smell inside is a mixture of wet fur, smoked meat, ash, and something biological you stopped noticing months ago. The ground beneath your body is hard and slightly damp. You have been sleeping on it your entire life. Your back knows every stone. You pull yourself upright, and your hands immediately touch your own face, crusted at the corners of the eyes, rough along the jaw, sticky near the hairline. You don't reach for water. Water is not close, and the morning has demands that come before comfort. Outside, the air hits you like a wall. It is not refreshing, it is violent. The wind carries grit and the smell of the open landscape, wet vegetation, decaying matter, the distant musk of animals. You scratch the back of your neck without thinking. You scratch your forearm. You have been scratching for days. Something is living in your hair. You know this. Everyone knows this. There is no solution to it. There is only the fire, which you light now, not for warmth first, but because the smoke keeps certain things away. This is not superstition. This is observation passed down through generations of bodies that learned, through injury and death, what helps and what doesn't. You crouch over the flame, let the smoke rise around your head, and feel the itching slow. It is the closest thing to relief you will have today. This world does not care about your comfort. It barely tolerates your existence. And yet, inside it, something extraordinary is happening. People are managing their bodies in a landscape designed to destroy them, using nothing but fire, fat, instinct, and inherited knowledge. Hygiene in 3000 BC is not an absence. It is a system, brutal, imperfect, and relentlessly practical. You are part of a band, not a family in the modern sense, something older and more functional. Between 15 and 30 people moving together, sharing resources, sharing risk, sharing space. There is no privacy. There is no concept of private hygiene. What happens to one body is visible to all. You sleep close. You smell each other constantly. You monitor each other, not out of social obligation, but out of survival necessity. A sick body is a danger to every other body. A wound that goes wrong is a death that could have been prevented. The social structure of this group is horizontal in ways that larger civilizations would never achieve again, but it is not gentle. It is efficient. The people with the most knowledge about plants, about wounds, about when to move camp and when to stay, carry the most weight. You learn from them not in structured lessons, but by watching, imitating, absorbing. You belong to a territory, but the territory does not belong to you. You follow animals, follow seasons, follow water. When a campsite becomes too contaminated, when the waste accumulates, when the smell draws predators, when the parasites multiply, you leave. This is not planned sanitation. It is instinct reinforced by consequence. Groups that stayed too long in fouled ground got sick. The ones that moved survived to teach their children to move. You are the descendant of the ones who moved. Your entire hygiene system is built on this single, ancient logic. Distance from your own biological output is the difference between infection and survival. You don't know germ theory. You know what happens to a camp that ignores it. Now that you understand the world you inhabit, the question that follows is unavoidable. What does surviving inside it demand from your body every single day? The first thing your body demands is labor that destroys the skin. Every day, you use your hands for tasks that would be considered extreme in any later period of human history. You scrape hides with bone tools, grinding against resistance until your palms crack. You carry loads across rough terrain, and the skin of your feet hardens into a kind of natural armor. But it also splits along the heel in cold weather, and those splits are open wounds. You process bone with stone, and the friction produces fine dust that coats your throat. You dig, you lift, you drag. The physical cost of subsistence in this period is not metaphorical. Skeletal remains examined by physical anthropologists reveal a pattern of bone stress and joint degeneration in individuals who were, by age, still young. The body was used at maximum capacity from adolescence onward. There was no preservation of the body for later. There was only the immediate demand of the day. The skin, under these conditions, was never clean in any meaningful sense. It was managed. Animal fat was applied regularly, not as cosmetic practice, but as barrier function. Uncovered, cracked skin in cold wind becomes infected skin. Infected skin becomes systemic infection. Communities that used fat survived skin injuries at higher rates. This is not a theory. It is a biological outcome recorded in the archaeological evidence of who survived long enough to leave skeletal remains. The fat was rendered from the same animals you ate, stored in bladders, applied with hands. The smell was thick, rancid after days, and completely irrelevant to the people using it. Smell was not a hygiene standard here. Function was. But even functional skin management could not protect you from what the environment placed inside the body every time you ate, drank, or breathed. Water was the most dangerous thing you consumed every day, not because prehistoric people were careless, because the landscape offered no separation between clean water and contaminated water that the eye could detect. A stream that looked clear could carry the biological residue of a dead animal upstream, a predator's territory, the waste of the group that camped along the same bank 2 days before you arrived. You had no way to know. You drank. You drank because dehydration killed faster than the things in the water. The calculus was brutal and unavoidable. Archaeological analysis of dental plaque preserved in prehistoric remains has revealed the microbial communities that lived inside these mouths, and through those findings, evidence of what people ingested regularly. Parasitic infections were not exceptional events. They were a baseline condition of the body, managed through behavioral practice and plant use, never fully eliminated. Certain plants, known to have anti-parasitic properties, appear consistently in the archaeological record near human settlements of this period. Not because prehistoric people understood pharmacology, but because groups that consumed these plants by accident or by inherited habit got sick less often, and the habit survived. This is how medicine began, not in intention, in outcome. The water problem did not have a solution. It had adaptations. Bodies that survived chronic low-level contamination developed tolerance. Those that didn't died before passing on their vulnerability. You were not clean. You were selected. And then there is the wound, the cut, the puncture, the bite, the abrasion that breaks skin and introduces the outside world into the inside of the body. This was the most immediate hygiene crisis in this period, not theoretical contamination, but the daily reality of working with tools that cut, animals that bite, terrain that tears. A wound in 30 Zawun BC was not a medical event. It was a biological negotiation with an outcome that could not be predicted. The body's own response was the primary defense. Swelling, heat, pain. These were not symptoms to be treated, but processes to be supported. What communities had learned through watching wounds heal and watching wounds kill was that certain interventions helped and certain interventions accelerated death. Fire was used to cauterize. Certain plant materials were applied as poultice. Evidence of medicinal plant use in this period is well established in the archaeological record. The interior of wounds was sometimes scraped clean with bone tools. None of this was sterile. All of it was the best available option. Infection killed people who had survived predators, starvation, and winter. This was the great equalizer of prehistoric hygiene. The hunter who had survived every external threat could be destroyed by the bacteria introduced through a cut on his hand while processing a carcass. The body that had endured a lifetime of cold and scarcity could fail within days because of what entered through a small break in the skin. This knowledge, that small injuries could kill, was not abstract. It was visible in every community, in every season, and it shaped behavior at a level so deep that the responses became instinct. There is something about this world that most people never consider, something that sits underneath all the fire management, the fat application, the wound care, and the water avoidance, a practice that would, if seen without context, appear disturbing to any modern observer. In this period, the dead were not always removed from the living space. Not because prehistoric people were indifferent to death. The evidence of ritual burial in this era makes clear that death was treated with deliberate ceremony. But because the process of transition took time, and the group had to keep moving, and the body of someone who had just died still contained warmth, still carried the smell of the living, and was sometimes kept close for reasons that existed at the boundary between the emotional and the biological. Remains examined from Upper Paleolithic sites in Europe show evidence of bodies being held, carried, and repositioned over time, not buried immediately, but handled across a period of days. This was not neglect. It was grief, taking the only form available to people who had no separation between the living and the dead as categories, only as conditions. The consequence from a hygiene perspective was exposure. The group that handled a body dead of infection was exposed to whatever had killed it. There was no protocol because there was no understanding of transmission. The behavior that looks, from the outside, like a failure of hygiene was actually an expression of a social bond so powerful that biological risk became irrelevant. You don't abandon the people you love, not even when they have stopped breathing. This did not change in 30,000 BC. It was simply more expensive. The understanding of contagion, that a dead body could kill the living through proximity, would not emerge as organized knowledge for thousands of years. In this world, the price of love was sometimes paid in fever. There was no law in 30,000 BC. There was something more binding, the obligation of proximity. In a group of 20 people moving through a hostile landscape, transgression against the group was not a moral abstraction, it was a survival threat. The person who consumed more than their share, who abandoned a task, who failed to maintain their body in functional condition, was a liability that the group could not afford. The enforcement of behavioral norms was not institutional. It was social, immediate, and unambiguous. This extended directly to hygiene practices. The management of waste, the treatment of wounds, the handling of the sick. These were not private matters. They affected everyone within the shelter's radius. The group's survival was partially dependent on whether individuals maintained practices that protected the collective biological environment. A person who defecated too close to the water source, or who failed to treat an infected wound before it became systemic, or who brought a contaminated animal product into the sleeping space. These behaviors were corrected not through legislation, but through the direct pressure of people whose lives depended on the correction. The authority in this structure belonged to knowledge. The person who understood which plants reduced fever, who knew how to read the condition of a wound, who could identify the signs of contamination in a water source. That person held a form of power that predated every institution ever built. And when that person died before transferring their knowledge, the group lost something more critical than a body. They lost a system. The vulnerability this created was not abstract. Communities that lost their most experienced members to sudden death sometimes lost the behavioral knowledge that kept the group functional. Surviving here was also about protecting the people who knew how to survive. The most consistently vulnerable members of this world were the very young and the very old. But the vulnerability was distributed differently across these two groups. and the mechanisms were distinct in ways that reveal how the body's relationship with hygiene was shaped by age. For the very young, the first years of life were a gauntlet of biological exposure that the body had not yet developed the tolerance to manage. Infant mortality in prehistoric populations was catastrophic by any modern standard. Not because of dramatic events, but because of the accumulated biological pressure of daily life. Contaminated surfaces, inconsistent nutrition, the parasitic load of the environment, the simple reality of an immune system meeting the world for the first time. Skeletal remains from this period show evidence of nutritional stress, repeated infection, and developmental interruption in children who survived to early childhood but died before adolescence. The care given to these bodies was real. Evidence of deliberate burial of infants, of ochre application, of objects placed near small bodies makes clear that these deaths were mourned. But mourning and prevention were not the same tool. There was no way to sterilize the environment in which children grew. There was no way to isolate a sick infant from the group without exposing the child to cold and predation. Every protective instinct led toward closeness, and closeness was also the vector of transmission. The body of the person who carried you was both your warmth and your contamination risk. This was not a solvable problem. It was a condition of the world, managed imperfectly, endured continuously. When the pressure became total, when winter was long, when the group had been stationary too long, when a contaminated water source coincided with an injury that went wrong, the systems that maintained biological stability failed not in isolation, but together. First, the food supply thinned. Then the bodies that were already managing infection became too weakened to recover. Then the cold pressed in more completely against bodies with less fat reserves. Then the group diminished, had fewer hands to do the work of keeping everyone alive. This cascade was not rare. It was the recurring crisis of a world operating without margins. The distance between a functional group and a collapsing one was not large. It was one bad season, one critical death, one outbreak of something the group had no previous exposure to. Communities that archaeological evidence shows to have disappeared from a location during this period may have left, or may have simply ended. The distinction is often invisible from the evidence. What the evidence does show is that occupation sites were abandoned, sometimes suddenly, sometimes in conditions that suggest acute crisis rather than planned migration. The body, at the center of all of this, was not a passive victim. It was a working system pushed to its biological limit and expected to continue. The immune system of a person living in 30 EO0 BC was not weaker than a modern immune system. In many respects, it was more continuously tested. But testing without adequate resources is not strength. It is attrition. The bodies that survived did so at a cost that accumulated invisibly, in the density of bone, in the wear of joints, in the record of repeated stress written into the skeleton over a lifetime. And yet, groups persisted. Populations survived. The anatomically modern human beings who navigated this world did not disappear. They multiplied, spread across continents, and eventually built every civilization that followed. The resistance that made this possible was not dramatic. It was the quietest kind of endurance, a fire that lasted through the night, a wound that closed instead of opening further, a winter that ended, a child that reached the age where their immune system had built enough experience to survive the next infection. These were not small victories dressed in modern language. They were the actual content of a good day in 30 Ziuazonaran BC. The definition of success was not improvement, it was continuation. What the people of this period passed forward was not just genetic survival. They passed forward knowledge. The plant that reduced fever, the behavior that kept the sleeping area free of contamination, the technique for rendering fat that would preserve it long enough to matter. The practice of moving camp before the ground became too foul to be safe. None of this was written. None of it was formal. All of it was carried in the behavior of people who survived long enough to show others what worked. And those others survived long enough to show more people. This is the origin of hygiene, not in cleanliness as an aesthetic, but in knowledge as inheritance. When you imagine prehistoric life, the image that surfaces is usually one of two things, either brutal and chaotic or romantically simple. Both are wrong. The world of 3000 BC was neither. It was a biological environment of extraordinary complexity, managed by groups of human beings, using every cognitive and physical resource available to them, operating without the institutions, the materials, or the knowledge that we now take as the baseline of human existence. The hygiene they practiced was not primitive in the sense of being thoughtless. It was the leading edge of human problem-solving applied to the most immediate problem anybody has ever faced: staying alive inside a world that produces contamination faster than any individual can avoid it. What this period reveals, when examined closely, is not the distance between them and us. It is the continuity. The logic that drove prehistoric humans to use smoke against parasites, fat against cracked skin, distance against waste, and fire against infection is the same logic that eventually built antiseptics, soap, and municipal water treatment. The method changed. The problem never did. Think honestly for a moment. If you were placed in this world with no modern tools, no knowledge of germ theory, and no infrastructure, how long before your body started negotiating terms with the environment? Leave your answer in the comments. The answers are usually more honest than people expect. If this kind of deep historical reconstruction is something you want more of, subscribe. New episodes go further back and forward into worlds that shape the one you live in now. The next one may be the hardest to imagine yet.